Gen Z is on track to be the poorest generation in Canada's history. And I say that for many reasons because it's not that Gen Z lacks ambition or motivation or discipline. It's that the future that previous generations are selling them, housing, stable jobs, retirement with a pension, no longer exists. And the earlier previous generations can understand the unique position that Gen Z is in, the better the advice will resonate, and perhaps the more creative and out of the box thinking Gen Z can start thinking about their future, because the past doesn't always dictate the future. Let me explain. Let me start just a few decades ago. Back in the 1970s, baby boomers were entering a period where tuition was just a few $100s. And if you adjust student tuition for inflation, that's still just $2,000 to $3,000 by today's levels. Tuition today, depending on the program, can be anywhere from $5,000 all the way up to $10,000 and plus. But here's where it gets really interesting. Housing. Housing in the 1970s was around $40,000 to $50,000 to $60,000 for the average home. But your take-home pay was $10,000 to $16,000. So the multiples, the ratios weren't that bad. It was about 4-to-1 for a house. So it wasn't like completely out of the realm of possibility. Then came Generation X, and the average home started really going up in the 1980s and 90s, about $150,000. But salaries also went up pretty well during this time, on average to about $30,000. So the multiple here is still about 5-to-1. The ratio between house ownership and your take-home pay is still about 5-to-1. And tuition for university was around $2,000, which again is still very reasonable given the person's take-home pay. I just want to mention too, stable, permanent jobs were much more prolific during this time as well. Jobs with pensions and benefits too. So I just want to put that caveat in as we start looking at future generations. Then millennials arrived. I mentioned this before, but the average condo price in the GTA went from about $200,000 in 2010 to nearly $600,000 in 2020. That's madness. The average price of homes in Canada grew 165% from 2005 to 2020. That's just a 15-year period. But remember the interesting thing that I pointed to in my last video. The stress test was introduced in 2016, meaning that even if you wanted to sign on to a mortgage, the stress test made it nearly impossible for a young person starting out. In tuition, there was a retrenching by all governments or most governments in the G7 after the 2008 financial crisis. So post-secondary education suddenly became much more expensive than previous years and previous generations. And so suddenly telling people, go to university, get a really good job, buy a house, start a family, retire with a pension, that trajectory suddenly became out of reach for many millennials. And then Gen Z came onto the scene. And this is where the wage to housing gap just grew exponentially to the point where that theory of house ownership, marriage, kids, pension, stable job, it no longer applies. For 20 to 34-year-olds, wages only grew about 20% from 2000 to 2024. That's a 24-year period. House prices during this period rose 350%, and the stress test was introduced in 2016, meaning it was much harder to secure a mortgage than ever before. So to put this into perspective, while boomers saw about a 4-to-1 ratio between house prices and their take-home pay, today for some, it's about 11, 12, 13, 14x. That's the ratio. So for example, if you're out of school, you're 25, you might be making 50 to 60K. Let's say 60K on average. If you want to buy a condo in downtown Toronto, even in this market, the average price is still in the 500s, 550, 600s, and that's a 10x multiple. And that's saying that you qualify given the stress test. Again, if you're making a little bit below 40K, chances are you're probably not going to qualify for that mortgage, even if you have a lot saved. But it's not just about buying a house either. It's not about just qualifying for a mortgage. Rent on average across the entire country is around $2,000 to $2,100 a month. That's on average. So if you are Gen Z and if you are coming out of university, even if you make a really good pay, the rent is expensive too. And in these hypothetical scenarios, I'm saying that a Gen Z person is graduating with zero student debt. Many students are graduating with a lot of student debt because tuition is costing five, six, seven, $8,000 a year. And that's the undergraduate programs. Graduate programs are now probably $15,000 to $20,000 a year for some programs. And I've mentioned this before on previous videos, but youth unemployment in Canada averages 15%. And I say that with an asterisk because that's just youth unemployment that they can measure. There's underemployment too, working multiple jobs. And that's what's reported. What's not reported are perhaps many more youth in specific communities that are looking for jobs and can't find any. So I mentioned in previous videos that all types of decisions, life decisions, are being delayed for Gen Z given the economy and everything that's happening. But also I need to mention this too. It's not just big life decisions. There's this loss in trust in our institutions by Gen Z. And I can understand why. I mean, they've been sold this dream of home ownership leading to wealth building as early as possible. Well, that dream no longer makes sense. And I haven't done enough research on this, but I imagine that today there's far less permanent full-time pension benefits positions, especially for young people. To me, it seems that even our biggest institutions are moving to more contract work that are precarious, that have end dates, that don't give the security for Gen Z to start building their future for the pathway forward. And this poses a big issue because once trust is lost in our institutions, it's going to be really hard to regain that. So, why do I think this is a big issue? Because when you put all of these pieces together, it starts painting this very bleak picture. The first, no assets, no compounding wealth. That is major, right? The earlier you start, the longer, the longer your runway, the more you can compound that wealth. You could retire early, do all types of things, circulate that money however you want. The second, when you're starting out, you're facing some of the higher taxes on your earnings relative to what you're making and how you can survive. So if you're making 45 to 80K, taxes do take up a big chunk proportionally of your take home pay. Meaning, if you're spending a lot on rent because you can't own, you can't save as much because the cost of living is so high. And speaking of cost of living, rising cost of living, it it hurts all of us, but it wipes out the savings disproportionately for those in Gen Z starting out who are on the lower rungs of the professional ladder trying to make it work. And then on top of that, like I mentioned before, I'm sure it's much more a precarious labor market more now than ever before, and that makes it even harder for Gen Z to understand that they should start saving for a house and marriage and retirement and pension even at 25 years old because there's no permanency in many of the sectors that they're applying. So this is the question I want to leave you with because it's something that I'm wrestling with after looking at all the data. Does hard work still guarantee a good future? Because if you're young, if you're 25 years old and you did everything right, you went to school, you got all the scholarships, you graduated with zero debt, you enter the job market, you get a really well-paying job, you still wouldn't be able to afford a home. You wouldn't be able to afford rent plus savings plus other things. You wouldn't be able to afford all the necessities to life. It would take you so much longer to start compounding wealth at a young age. I'm not saying it's impossible. It definitely is possible. But the pressure on Gen Z now it's unlike any other pressure from any other generation. And so I think previous generations, myself, my generation, the millennial generation as well included, we have to start rethinking our advice to Gen Z. It can't just be save your money, buy a house, and retire. That doesn't work anymore. Perhaps the new way of thinking is about, hey, save whatever you can because it really does matter in the long term. And if you can't buy a home, I understand, but maybe you can save like 20, $30 every paycheck. Trust me, it does compound. That's what I think our advice can start being, and understand they have a long way to get to where millennials, boomers, Gen X got much earlier in their lives. And the last thing, I think our governments really need to start revisiting things like tax relief, perhaps for Gen Z. Maybe there's more incentives they can do for first-time home buyers who are Gen Z. Maybe there's like, I don't know, more tax relief, um, all types of things they can do with that just to help them get into housing. And maybe there's programs that they can do to help with first mortgage payments, for a first period of time. I don't know, but I feel like there's some additional help that Gen Z will need to build long-term success in this country. But I don't hear our politicians talking about this, and I wonder why. So drop a like, share, and comment in the comment section below. Let me know what you think. Is this future as bleak as I'm painting it out to be, or do you see some merit and some hope for the future ahead? Thanks again, everyone. I'll catch you in the next one.